In the spring of 1994, in a quiet farming town in the American Midwest, a 5-year-old girl began telling her parents about a place they had never seen. She spoke about a woman she said was crying. She described red flowers near a patch of open land, and she repeated the same chilling sentence over and over. "She's under the flowers." At first, her family believed it was nothing more than the imagination of a child. But the girl kept adding details. She described the woman's clothing. She described where the body was hidden. And then she gave a name. It was a name her parents had never heard before. The child was too young to read, too young to understand death, and too young to know that miles away, police were still searching for a missing woman whose disappearance had baffled investigators for months. When detectives finally followed the location the child described, they uncovered evidence connected to a real unsolved case. A missing woman, a burial site, and details that had never been released to the public. Investigators were left with a question no one could answer. How could a 5-year-old child describe the hidden details of a murder she was never supposed to know about? Because the most unsettling part of this case was not what the child said. It was that every detail led police closer to the truth. The town of Ashwood sat quietly among miles of farmland and dense stretches of woodland in the American Midwest. It was the kind of place most people passed through without noticing. A handful of roads cut between open fields. Weathered barns stood beside gravel driveways. Front porches faced empty country roads where the loudest sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional truck passing in the distance. Nothing about Ashwood suggested danger. It was small enough that nearly everyone knew one another. Neighbors waved from across their yards. Children rode bicycles along the roadside until the sun began to set. On warm afternoons, the sound of church bells carried through town, while dogs barked somewhere in the distance. Life moved slowly there, peacefully. Days followed the same familiar rhythm. And for the families who lived there, that quiet routine brought a sense of comfort. It was the kind of town where doors were often left unlocked, where children played outside without fear, and where serious crime felt like something that happened somewhere else. For Benjamin and Charlotte Johnson, Ashwood was exactly the place they wanted to raise a family. Their home sat near the edge of town, just beyond the last row of houses, where the farmland opened into wide fields bordered by trees. It was modest but comfortable. A small white house with a porch in front, a backyard stretching toward the woods, and enough distance from the road to make the property feel private. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that made every ordinary sound stand out. The creak of the porch steps, the rustle of leaves in the evening, the laughter of a child playing alone in the yard. Benjamin worked long hours, and Charlotte spent most of her time at home caring for their 5-year-old daughter, Emily. Emily was a quiet child, gentle, reserved. She preferred to spend time by herself, sitting on the floor with her toys, speaking softly to herself as she played. Her parents saw it as a sign of imagination. She created stories, gave names to her dolls, and often carried on long conversations in a voice barely loud enough for anyone else to hear. There was nothing unusual about it. To Benjamin and Charlotte, Emily was simply thoughtful and creative. She was healthy, calm, and well-behaved, the kind of child who rarely caused concern. And the Johnson family's life reflected the calm around them. Their days were ordinary. Breakfast in the kitchen each morning. Afternoons spent in the yard. Evenings settling into silence as darkness covered the fields around the house. Nothing interrupted that routine. Nothing suggested that anything was out of place. In a town like Ashwood, people believed they knew what danger looked like. And because violence had never touched their quiet community, it was easy to believe they were far away from it. That sense of safety shaped everything. It shaped how neighbors trusted one another, how parents raised their children, and how the Johnson family interpreted the small details of everyday life. So when Emily began saying things that made no sense, no one treated it as a warning. Not at first, because in a town this peaceful, no one expects the impossible to begin in a child's bedroom. And no one imagines that the first sign of something deeply unsettling could sound as innocent as a little girl talking to herself while she plays. This section sets the calm atmosphere and ends with a soft, uneasy transition into the strange events. For the Johnson family, life in Ashwood followed the same gentle rhythm every day. Morning began early. Benjamin left for work just after sunrise, driving down the same narrow road that cut through the fields beyond their home. Charlotte stayed behind with Emily, filling the quiet hours with the small routines that gave structure to their lives. There was comfort in that routine. Each day unfolded almost exactly like the one before it. After breakfast, Emily would spend hours outside in the yard behind the house. She played alone most of the time, content to sit in the grass with a handful of dolls or wander along the edge of the trees collecting stones, flowers, and fallen leaves. She rarely asked for company. She seemed perfectly at ease in her own small world. Charlotte often watched her from the kitchen window while preparing lunch, seeing nothing unusual in the way Emily talked softly as she played. Sometimes she spoke to her dolls. Sometimes she answered herself in a different voice. And sometimes she seemed to be carrying on a conversation no one else could hear. But to her parents, it was ordinary childhood imagination. Emily had always been that way. She invented names for her toys. She created elaborate stories while arranging them in the grass. She spoke with the kind of seriousness children often have when pretending, as if the world in front of them were entirely real. Charlotte sometimes smiled as she listened through the open kitchen window. There was something comforting about those quiet conversations drifting in from the yard. Inside the house, the day moved peacefully. Charlotte prepared meals while Emily sat at the kitchen table with crayons and paper spread out in front of her. She loved to draw. Most of her pictures were simple: flowers, trees, houses, smiling stick figures holding hands beneath a bright sun. Charlotte saved many of them, stacking them neatly in a kitchen drawer. Every now and then, Emily would explain the stories behind the drawings. Some were cheerful, some strange, but never alarming. Children often said unusual things, and Emily, with her vivid imagination, said more unusual things than most. Still, nothing about it seemed concerning. By late afternoon, the house settled into its quietest hours. The sun lowered behind the trees, the shadows stretched across the yard, and Charlotte finished preparing dinner before Benjamin returned home. In the evenings, the three of them gathered around the table, talking softly about the day. The conversations were simple. Benjamin spoke about work. Charlotte spoke about errands, chores, and whatever Emily had done that afternoon. Emily listened quietly, occasionally adding some small detail about a drawing she made or a game she played. After dinner, they spent the rest of the evening in familiar ways. Benjamin sat in the living room while Charlotte cleaned the kitchen. Emily played on the floor with her dolls, arranging them in careful little groups and whispering stories under her breath. The same bedtime came each night, the same bath. The same pajamas, the same storybook read in the same chair beside her bed. The repetition was comforting, predictable, the kind of ordinary routine that made each day feel safe. And Emily fit naturally into that quiet rhythm. She was imaginative, but she was gentle. She often said things that were unusual enough to make her parents laugh, but never unusual enough to make them worry. She might tell Charlotte that one of her dolls was afraid of the dark, or explain that an imaginary friend wanted to sit beside her at dinner. Sometimes she described dreams in vivid detail, blending them so naturally with the real world that it was hard to tell where imagination ended. But to her parents, these were harmless stories, a normal part of childhood. They were used to hearing odd things from her. So when Emily began saying things that seemed a little stranger than usual, Benjamin and Charlotte reacted the same way they always had. They smiled, they listened, and they assumed it was another story. Because when a child lives so comfortably in her imagination, it becomes easy to dismiss the unusual. Easy to treat every strange word as fantasy. The Johnsons had no reason to think otherwise. Nothing in their lives suggested that anything was wrong. Their home was peaceful, their daughter was healthy, and their days passed with the kind of quiet regularity that makes people believe tomorrow will be just like today. That sense of normalcy made the first warning easy to overlook. It happened during one of those ordinary afternoons. Emily was seated at the kitchen table with crayons scattered around her, quietly drawing while Charlotte prepared dinner only a few feet away. There was nothing unusual about the moment, nothing to suggest that the words Emily spoke next would be the first sign that something was deeply wrong. Without looking up from the paper, Emily said something so unexpected that Charlotte stopped what she was doing and turned toward the table. At first it sounded like another piece of childish imagination. Just another strange sentence from a creative little girl. But this time, Emily was describing something no 5-year-old should have known. And for the first time, Charlotte felt the calm certainty of their ordinary life begin to shift. This ends the comfort phase and transitions directly into the first unsettling statement. It happened during an ordinary evening. Charlotte stood at the kitchen counter preparing dinner while Emily sat nearby with a box of crayons spread across the table. The scene was familiar. Emily hummed softly to herself as she drew, completely absorbed in the picture in front of her. Charlotte paid little attention at first. Her daughter often narrated her drawings out loud, inventing little stories as shapes and colors appeared on the page. It was part of the rhythm of the house, comforting in its familiarity. Then Emily spoke in a calm, absent-minded voice. "The lady under the flowers is cold." Charlotte paused for a moment, glancing over her shoulder. Emily did not look up. She kept coloring as though she had said nothing unusual. Charlotte smiled faintly, assuming it was part of whatever imaginary story her daughter was creating. "Who's cold?" she asked. Emily answered without hesitation. "The lady under the red flowers." There was no fear in her voice, no emotion at all. She sounded as casual as if she were describing the weather. Charlotte walked over to the table and looked down at the drawing. On the paper was a patch of red crayon flowers beside a group of trees. Beneath them, Emily had drawn a figure lying flat on the ground. The image was strange, but not enough to alarm her. Children drew unusual things all the time, and Emily's imagination often wandered into places adults did not fully understand. Charlotte asked gently, "Who is the lady?" Emily shrugged. Then she said, "She cries because she can't get out." Charlotte gave a small laugh, the kind adults use when they hear something unsettling from a child, but choose not to treat it seriously. She assumed Emily was repeating something from a dream, or inventing another story to match the picture. "What else happens in your story?" Charlotte asked. Emily continued coloring as she answered, "The man put her there." Charlotte's smile faded slightly. Still, she kept her tone light. "What man?" Emily thought for a moment. Then she said, "The man with muddy boots." There was something in the way Emily said it. Matter of fact, direct, as though she were recalling an ordinary memory instead of inventing a story. Charlotte stared at the drawing for another moment, then brushed the feeling aside. Children created strange narratives from the smallest things. A flower bed in the yard, a muddy pair of boots by the door. Fragments of stories could become something vivid in a child's imagination. By the time Benjamin came home that evening, Charlotte had almost forgotten about it. At dinner, she mentioned it casually. She laughed as she described Emily's drawing and the odd little story that came with it. Benjamin laughed too. Neither of them treated it as anything more than childish fantasy. To them, it was simply one of the strange little comments children make. Odd for a moment, then easily forgotten. But over the next few days, Emily repeated the story. That was what began to trouble Charlotte. It was not just that Emily kept mentioning the woman. It was that the details never changed. While playing in the yard, Emily told her dolls that the woman was still under the flowers. While coloring at the kitchen table, she drew the same patch of red flowers near the same group of trees. At bedtime, she whispered that the crying woman was lonely. Each time, the same details returned. A woman under the flowers, a man in muddy boots, trees nearby, red flowers marking the place. Charlotte began asking more questions, partly out of curiosity and partly because the consistency felt unusual. Children's stories normally shifted and changed. One day a doll was a princess. The next day it was a doctor. Imaginary details moved freely from one idea to another, but Emily's story remained exactly the same. When Charlotte asked where the flowers were, Emily always answered, "Near the trees." When she asked who the man was, Emily said only, "The man with the boots." And when she asked how the woman got there, Emily repeated, "He put her there." The answers came quickly, without hesitation, as if Emily were describing something she had seen rather than something she had imagined. Charlotte mentioned it to Benjamin again. This time, neither of them laughed as easily. They still did not feel fear, only confusion. They searched for harmless explanations. Maybe Emily had overheard part of a television program. Maybe she had seen something in one of Benjamin's old crime novels. Maybe the image had come from a dream, vivid enough to feel real. Every explanation sounded reasonable enough. And because their life was so ordinary, so peaceful, they had no reason to imagine anything else. There was no threat in the house, no history of strange events, nothing to make them believe the words of a 5-year-old could mean more than imagination. Still, a quiet unease began to settle over the household. Charlotte noticed herself watching Emily more closely, listening when she played alone, paying attention to the stories she whispered to her dolls. And the more she listened, the more one thing stood out. Emily never treated the story like pretend. She never smiled when she talked about it. Never changed the details. Never added the playful exaggerations children usually invent. She spoke with calm certainty, as though the woman under the flowers was real, as though the place she described truly existed somewhere. Benjamin and Charlotte told themselves not to overreact. They reminded each other that children often say things adults cannot explain, and for a while that reassurance was enough. Until Emily added one more detail. A detail so specific, so unexpected, that it was no longer easy to dismiss as imagination. Because one afternoon, without warning, Emily gave directions. And for the first time, her parents began to wonder whether she was describing a real place. The first time Emily described where the woman was buried, Charlotte felt a chill she could not explain. It happened in the middle of another ordinary afternoon. Emily sat on the living room floor with crayons and paper, quietly drawing, while Charlotte folded laundry nearby. Without looking up, Emily said, almost casually, "She's near the fence by the trees." Charlotte turned toward her. "Who is?" she asked. Emily continued drawing. "The lady under the flowers." Charlotte stared for a moment, waiting for the story to change, but it did not. Emily pointed to the paper in front of her. There was the familiar patch of red flowers, the line of trees, and this time, a wooden fence drawn just beside them. It was another precise detail added to the same strange story she had been repeating for days. Charlotte tried to keep her voice calm. "What happened to her?" Emily answered in the same quiet, steady tone she always used. "She got hurt with a shovel." The words were so direct that Charlotte froze. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Emily said it the way a child might describe someone dropping a toy or scraping a knee. Charlotte forced herself to respond casually. "How did she get hurt?" Emily kept coloring. Then she said, "He hit her, and she couldn't breathe." The room felt suddenly silent. Charlotte looked at her daughter, searching for some sign that this was pretend. But Emily's expression was calm, focused. She was not frightened. She was not inventing excitedly the way children do when telling make-believe stories. She spoke as though she were describing something ordinary, something she somehow knew. That evening, Charlotte told Benjamin everything Emily had said. This time, neither of them laughed. The story had become too detailed, too consistent. The words Emily used did not sound like the kind of fantasy they expected from a 5-year-old. She was describing violence in calm, specific terms: a woman, a shovel, a burial place near a fence. And every time she told the story, the details remained exactly the same. Benjamin tried to explain it away. Maybe Emily had overheard something on television. Maybe she had picked up details from an adult conversation. Maybe she was blending pieces of different stories into one. But even as he said it, the explanation felt weak. Emily did not speak like she was inventing. She spoke like she was remembering. Over the following days, the story grew even more disturbing. Emily repeated the same details again and again. She said the woman was placed near the fence. She said the flowers grew over her. She said the man left her there. Each statement came with the same calm certainty, and then the drawings changed. Charlotte began noticing that Emily no longer drew bright, cheerful scenes. Instead, the same unsettling image appeared again and again. A line of trees, a wooden fence, a patch of red flowers. And beneath the flowers, a woman lying underground. The details became more deliberate. Emily colored the flowers bright red. She shaded the soil dark brown. She drew the woman with her arms stiff at her sides beneath the ground. Charlotte saved every picture. At first she kept them because she was disturbed. Then she kept them because she wanted proof. Proof that the details were real and not something she was imagining after hearing Emily repeat the story so many times. Soon, Benjamin began writing down what Emily said. The date, the words, the details she added. Neither parent said it out loud, but they had begun to fear that something about this was deeply wrong. Not because they believed in anything supernatural, but because Emily's descriptions were becoming impossible to dismiss. No matter when they asked, no matter how casually they questioned her, the answers remained the same. The woman had been buried near a fence. She had been hurt with a shovel. She could not breathe. And the flowers marked the place. Then one evening, Emily added something new. Benjamin was the one sitting with her at the kitchen table while she drew. He asked the question gently, expecting the same vague answers as before. "Who is the woman?" Emily did not hesitate. She said, "Her name was Anna." Benjamin felt the room go still. Until then, the story had been strange but abstract. A nameless woman. An imaginary victim in an imaginary place. But now there was a name. A specific, simple name spoken with the same certainty as every other detail. Benjamin wrote it down. That night, after Emily had gone to bed, he and Charlotte sat together in the living room with a list of everything she had said. They read through the details again. A woman buried near trees, red flowers, a fence, a shovel, a name. Anna. The most unsettling part was not any one detail. It was how every detail fit together. The story was not random. It was coherent, consistent, specific in ways a child's fantasy usually was not. For the first time, Benjamin considered the possibility that the name meant something real. The next day, he began searching through old newspaper archives at the local library. At first, he found nothing. Then he widened the search to missing persons reports from neighboring counties. And buried in an old article from several years earlier, he found a case that stopped him cold. A woman named Anna had disappeared. She had vanished without explanation after leaving work one evening. No body had ever been found. The investigation had gone nowhere. The case remained unsolved. Benjamin stared at the article in disbelief. The name alone could have been coincidence. But after everything Emily had said, coincidence no longer felt like a comfortable explanation. He copied the article and brought it home. That evening, he and Charlotte sat in silence as they read every detail. The woman's name was Anna. She had disappeared years before, and no one had ever discovered what happened to her. The room felt heavier with every line, because suddenly Emily's story was no longer just a child's strange imagination. It now appeared to connect to a real woman, a real disappearance, and a mystery that had never been solved. Benjamin and Charlotte wanted to believe it was chance, that Emily had somehow heard the name before, that their fear was making them see connections that were not there. But one fact would not leave their minds. Emily had spoken the name before they ever found the article. And if that was not coincidence, then the question became impossible to ignore. How did their 5-year-old daughter know the name of a missing woman no one in the family had ever heard of? That question changed everything. Because once the name became real, the story could no longer be treated as harmless. And the Johnsons began to realize they were no longer listening to childish imagination. They were listening to details that might point to a real crime. This section raises the tension and ends at the perfect point for the next stage. For several days, Benjamin and Charlotte argued with themselves over what to do. Part of them believed there had to be a simple explanation, a coincidence, something Emily had overheard. A misunderstanding made to seem meaningful only because they were frightened. But the list of details kept growing, and the more they compared those details to the missing woman's case, the harder it became to dismiss what they were hearing. Emily had named the woman. She had described the burial near trees and a fence. She had spoken of red flowers marking the place, and she had said the woman had been struck with a shovel. None of it made sense. But ignoring it no longer felt possible. Finally, Benjamin contacted the sheriff's department. The call was difficult to make. Even he understood how unbelievable it sounded. A 5-year-old child was repeating details that appeared to match an unsolved disappearance. There was no evidence, no witness, only the words of a little girl. At first, the investigators were skeptical. They listened politely as Benjamin explained the situation, but the explanation sounded absurd, even as he said it aloud. A child making strange statements was not the kind of lead detectives expected in an open case. Still, because the disappearance of Anna had never been solved, the investigators agreed to review the information. Benjamin handed over everything: the notes he had kept, the dates, Emily's drawings, every repeated detail. The detectives began comparing Emily's statements with the original missing persons file. At first, the similarities seemed broad. Anna had disappeared several years earlier. She had last been seen leaving work near a rural farming area outside town. Investigators had suspected foul play from the beginning, but they had never located a body. Without evidence, the case had stalled. Those details alone were troubling, but not enough to justify a search. Then investigators reviewed the specifics Emily had described: a burial place near trees, a fence line, red flowers, a shovel used in the attack. Those details had never appeared in the old newspaper articles Benjamin had found. They had not been released publicly. Only investigators knew that the original search had focused on farmland, near the property of a man Anna had once known. That property had included wooded land, old fencing, and a neglected flower bed behind a vacant farmhouse. Years earlier, officers had searched the area briefly but found nothing. The lead went cold. Now, hearing Emily's repeated description of red flowers near the trees, investigators returned to the old case file. One detective noted that behind the farmhouse, there had once been a line of flowering bushes along a fence. The area had been dismissed in the original search. The ground had shown no obvious signs of disturbance, and with no body, no confession, and no witnesses, the investigation had moved on. The officers decided to revisit the property, not because they believed the impossible, but because the child's details pointed to a location that had never been fully examined. The search began quietly. No media, no public attention, just investigators walking the neglected property once again. The farmhouse had long been abandoned. Grass had grown high around the fence line. The flower bushes were overgrown and wild. Years had passed since anyone had looked there with real suspicion. The officers moved slowly through the back of the property, comparing the land to the child's drawings. Trees, fence posts, overgrown red flowering bushes. The layout matched the picture Emily had drawn at the kitchen table. Investigators began searching the soil beneath the flower bed. At first, they found nothing. Then, several feet below the surface, the search team uncovered human remains. The discovery brought the entire investigation to a stop. The remains were buried exactly where Emily had described, near the fence beside the trees, under the overgrown red flowers. The case that had remained unsolved for years suddenly had a burial site. And the most unsettling part was that investigators had been led there by the words of a 5-year-old girl. The remains were later identified as Anna, the missing woman the town had long since stopped searching for. For investigators, the discovery changed everything. A case that had been frozen for years was suddenly active again. The location of the burial site reopened every question that had gone unanswered. And when detectives reviewed Emily's statements once more, one detail stood out above all the others. The child had repeatedly described a man wearing muddy work boots. To anyone outside the investigation, it sounded like another strange fragment from a child's imagination. But in the original case file, investigators had one primary suspect: a local man who had been questioned after Anna disappeared. Witnesses had reported seeing him wearing muddy work boots the evening Anna was last seen. That detail had never been released. It had been kept inside the investigation from the beginning. And yet Emily had described it before investigators reopened the case. There was no clear explanation, no evidence that the Johnson family knew the suspect. No reason their daughter could have heard that detail from anyone around her. But the match was exact. The name, the burial site, the flowers, the boots. One by one, the child's statements aligned with evidence from a real unsolved murder investigation. For detectives, that alignment led them back to the suspect. Faced with the recovered remains and the reopened investigation, pressure mounted quickly. And for the Johnson family, the horror was no longer in the story Emily told. The horror was that every word had been true. The child had described a hidden grave. She had identified the victim, and she had revealed details known only to investigators. No one could explain how. And no matter what theory anyone offered, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Without the child's words, the body might never have been found. The discovery of Anna's remains changed the town overnight. For years, her disappearance had existed only as an old, unsolved case. Something people remembered in fragments, then gradually stopped talking about. Now it was suddenly real again. The quiet farmland outside Ashwood was no longer just open land and abandoned property. It was an active crime scene. Investigators returned to evidence that had been sitting untouched for years. Old witness statements were reviewed, timelines were reconstructed, people connected to Anna were questioned again. What had once been treated as a disappearance was now a confirmed homicide investigation. And at the center of the renewed case was something no one could explain. A 5-year-old child had led investigators to the burial site. Word spread quickly. In a town as small as Ashwood, secrets rarely stayed contained. Rumors moved from one front porch to another. Neighbors whispered about the Johnson family. People who had once waved casually from across the yard now spoke about Emily in hushed voices. Some believed it was an extraordinary coincidence. Others believed the child had overheard something from an adult. And some believed there was no ordinary explanation at all. For the Johnson family, the attention became overwhelming. Reporters arrived within days. News crews appeared outside their home. People wanted interviews, they wanted answers. They wanted to know how a 5-year-old girl could reveal the location of a murder victim who had been hidden for years. Benjamin and Charlotte had no answer to give. They were trying to understand it themselves. The quiet routines that once defined their lives disappeared almost immediately. Their peaceful home became the center of unwanted attention. The same neighbors who once gave them privacy now watched from a distance. Strangers called the house. Reporters waited near the property. Every part of their ordinary life was interrupted by questions they could not answer. And investigators were asking the same questions. They interviewed Emily carefully, trying to understand where the information had come from. They asked whether anyone had spoken to her about Anna, whether she had seen something, whether she had overheard conversations at home or in town. Emily gave the same answer every time. She said, "The lady told me." Investigators pressed gently for more. They asked who the lady was. Emily answered simply, "Anna." They asked when the woman spoke to her. Emily said she did not know. She offered no complicated explanation, no dramatic story. Only the same quiet certainty she had shown from the beginning. According to Emily, the woman had told her where she was. Nothing more. For detectives, the statement solved nothing. It explained nothing about how the child knew the burial location. It did nothing to clarify how she had described details from the case that had never been released publicly. Yet despite repeated interviews, Emily never changed her answer. And just as unsettling as what she said was what she did not say. She showed no fear, no confusion. She spoke as though the answer were obvious, as though hearing from Anna was the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, the recovered remains gave investigators reason to reopen the case against the man they had once considered the main suspect. He was questioned again. Old evidence was re-examined. Witnesses were asked to revisit statements made years earlier. The discovery of the burial site strengthened the case, but proving murder after so much time had passed was difficult. Physical evidence had deteriorated, memories had faded, and the years between the disappearance and the discovery had left investigators with more questions than answers. Whether prosecutors had enough evidence to bring charges remained uncertain. The suspect remained under scrutiny, but the outcome of the investigation was never as clear as the discovery itself. For the public, the unanswered legal questions mattered less than the mystery surrounding Emily. That was what captured attention. That was what people remembered. The idea that a child had known what investigators could not find. For Benjamin and Charlotte, that attention became unbearable. They had wanted peace. Instead, they became the focus of national fascination. Every conversation seemed to return to the same impossible question. How did Emily know? Eventually, the Johnsons decided to leave Ashwood. They sold their home quietly and moved away, hoping distance would restore some sense of a normal life. The move was not about fear, it was about escape. Escape from the questions, escape from the reporters, escape from the constant feeling that their family had become part of something they did not understand. After the move, something changed. Emily stopped talking about Anna, the comments ended, the drawings stopped. She no longer mentioned the woman under the flowers. No more references to the fence. No more stories about muddy boots. It was as if the voice that had guided her had simply fallen silent. Benjamin and Charlotte never found an explanation for why it began or why it ended. They only knew that once the body was found, Emily had nothing more to say. In time, life slowly became quiet again. The media moved on. The public's attention faded, and the Johnson family tried to rebuild the calm they had lost. But some things never returned to normal, because no matter how many years passed, one question remained unanswered. How had a 5-year-old child described the hidden grave of a missing woman? How had she known details kept inside an unsolved investigation? And why did the voices stop the moment the body was found? Those questions remained long after the cameras left, long after the investigators moved on, long after the Johnson family disappeared from public view. The murder investigation had been reopened. A hidden grave had been found. A family's life had been changed forever. But the single most important answer was the one no one could provide. The child had led them to the truth. No one ever discovered how. In the end, the facts of the case remained simple. A missing woman was found. A burial site hidden for years was uncovered. An investigation that had long gone cold was reopened. And a family who had once lived in complete peace was left carrying questions that no one could answer. The evidence confirmed that Anna had been there all along, buried beneath the flowers, hidden in a place investigators had searched before but failed to uncover. For years, the truth had remained just out of reach. Then somehow, the silence was broken by the words of a 5-year-old child. Emily never explained how she knew. No evidence ever showed that she had overheard investigators. No family connection tied the Johnsons to Anna's disappearance. No clear chain of events ever emerged to explain how such precise details found their way into the mind of a little girl. Investigators considered every ordinary explanation they could. Maybe the child had overheard fragments of conversation without anyone realizing. Maybe details from the case had quietly spread through town over the years. Maybe coincidence had made unrelated details seem meaningful after the body was discovered. Each possibility offered some comfort. Each gave the mystery a shape people could understand. But none explained everything. None explained the location. None explained the repeated details. And none explained why the child described facts that investigators had never made public. That was the part no one could resolve. The case itself may have moved forward. The remains were found. The investigation was reopened. But the question at the center of it all remained untouched. How did the child know? For the Johnson family, that question never left, even after they moved away, even after Emily stopped talking about the woman, even after the town returned to its ordinary routines. The answer never came. Emily never spoke of Anna again. The drawings stopped. The strange comments ended. And whatever had begun in that quiet house disappeared as suddenly as it arrived. Life in Ashwood gradually settled back into familiar rhythms. The roads were quiet again. The field stood empty beneath the evening light. Neighbors returned to ordinary conversations, but the story remained, passed quietly from one person to another. A mystery remembered not because of violence, but because of the impossible way the truth was revealed. People could understand a hidden grave. They could understand an unsolved murder. What they could not understand was how the secret was uncovered. And that uncertainty lingered long after the investigation. Was it coincidence? A child's imagination connecting details by chance? Something overheard and repeated without understanding? Or was it something no one could explain? No report ever answered that question. No investigator could explain it, and no one who heard the story forgot the unease that came with it. Because in the end, the most unsettling part was not the crime itself. It was the possibility that the truth reached the surface in a way no one understood. The child never spoke of the woman again. But in that quiet town, people still wonder how a little girl uncovered a murder that no one else could.